Yes, right.
The same way that Phil Fisher and Pixar really had a lot of constraints with technology still developing CGI to the point that you felt like you didn't have to make any significant compromise to where you wanted to go with the story.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that briefly, and then as we translate into execution, because I want to get Joel in here. Okay, so at the front of this, what we had decided, Tom and myself both worked with DreamWorks Animations. We worked with large studios where the features were costing anywhere from $100 to $120 million, $150 to $200 million, right, per 90-minute feature. You're not paying any more at the box office for that price. If I had done it, which Despicable Me did across the street at Illumination, came in and did an $80 million pixel and blew our pants off, you know, with the $200 million Guardians, Rise of the Guardians, you know, the Santa Claus thing. Anyways, and it was just this like cold, like what in the world are we doing, spending this much money on these movies, and the ticket price is the same. So there was this real big, like, how do we rethink this? VeggieTales had already gone through that to the bankruptcy, which is when I joined them in 2004, post-bankruptcy, was new methodology, right? Which was after the Jonah feature, which we can talk long about, but it just cost way more than it should have, just due to production mismanagement. We were into a much more disciplined series, right, where we could keep these things efficiently running along. So coming into that, Keith Lengo and I crossed paths, a big idea, and then he was at a lot of other big studios. And so he and I had talked for years and years and years and years. I mean, probably, he said he'd worked on it for about 20 years, but about a new way to produce animation and CGI. So that was a going-in idea, was could we do animation just differently? It doesn't make any sense for the small team from Tennessee to go try to compete with major studios doing that game. They do great work, right? And it's too volatile for that. So instead, could we do it differently? And that really started changing how we approach the project as an overall. Okay, if we want to do it at a lower budget, we don't want to do a poor man's Ferrari, right? I can tell you that I have a Kia out back that'll beat your Porsche. I don't care. It doesn't work, right? It's really an idea that we have to come in with a whole different set of plans about how we're going to approach this. Okay, that was a lot of our discussion, and that then turned into, yes, there is trickle-down technology that absolutely exists, but so does the competitive landscape. So even though it's true that about 3 to maybe 5 years at most, whatever you see from Zootopia will end up being the rigging and rendering systems available to the common man. That does occur. That just means that the everyday cartoons on Netflix are just better, right? So everybody's better. So you're not distinctive in that regard, and it is simpler. I mean, Joel would probably just, it's not exactly simpler, but it is, you know, it does trickle down. We chose a different path. So a lot of that involved technology. I'm going to bring Joel into this conversation now because this is where we started turning into execution. So Joel works for the production house here in Nashville, Magnetic Dreams, which is awesome. And Joel had the same kind of sensibilities about just making animation in a different way. And so Keith, who's not here, had really worked hard on some new ways that we could render and had created, I'm going to pull up that Janner shot as a start, because that was done in January, I believe. Yeah, here he is. Okay, so Keith Lengo had been working on this, like I said, a number of times, and had come up with a rendering technique that turned into this guy.
I couldn't sleep. I heard something. I couldn't sleep. I heard something.
All right, so
I
I'm
couldn't
going to
sleep.
loop for a second. So a lot of things happening, which you ultimately you see in the short film, but a lot of things happening that were a really big technological breakthrough for us, and it's our actually proprietary tech that we actually own, which is awesome. And anytime you take a CGI character and put them on a 2D background, you're aware of that you just did that, right? You could tell that they live on top of it. It's kind of like, you guys, well, it's a little bit of this, but you know, old Looney Tunes where you could tell which rock they were going to pick up and throw because it was colored differently. It's that kind of thing. It's clearly not in the environment. It sits on top of. And so through probably 3 or 4 key things that Keith was able to pull out here, we're getting Janner, who's CGI, and a completely flat painting that is layered, but there. What's happening here, just to kind of quickly tell you, is 3 things. 1, there's a shader thing that's happening on his skin. He's been painted 3 different times. All of his skin textures all of him are painted 3 different times, and they're on a randomizer that's cycling so that his texture, he can hold still and he's still moving. In regular CGI, if a character holds still longer than like 3 to 4 frames, they die, like a puppet. If you've ever seen a puppet hanging, it's like the puppeteer's playing, and the moment it stops moving, it's like it dies. It's the weirdest thing. In CGI, they die really fast. And what's one of the things that makes CGI so expensive is because you have to keep them moving. And living holds are like where animators spend, man-hours-wise, a ton of time. So it's that, look out, and keep it alive, right? You got to keep it, and that's really, really hard, niggling the tail. As a human, you do it just fine, but you have to machinate every one of those little parts of this. So in ours, we wanted to, and you can see Jenner holds perfectly still at the end, but he doesn't die. And so part of that is he's got this shader thing happening. He also has an edge thing happening where his geometry is not fixed. So in CGI, it's real. It's a piece of geometry. The edges of it on ours is on a cycling thing that actually jiggles a little bit and makes it feel like it's cell shaded, right? So that's happening too. And then, of course, the motion signature. So we're looking for abstract that's cohesive. Cohesive abstraction. That's kind of a fun thing, huh? So cohesive abstraction. So what that means is, if we're going to give you abstract visuals, as we have, and we're going to put that in an abstract environment, as we also have, with lots of brush strokes, right? You can see all those. We cannot give you motion that is non-abstract. So, in fact, we actually did some tests, I don't have those, unfortunately, but where the characters moved fluidly, like you see in regular CGI, and it broke it. Didn't work, because everything else is abstract. So if you imagined in stop motion, this happens. Leica's getting closer and closer as they get smoother and smoother, but Leica is still keeping a little edge in their movement, right, in stop motion. They don't let the characters move completely fluidly, because it breaks it. Your brain kind of goes, what's happening? Because this is moving fluidly as real world, but everything around me visually is not, is more abstract. So we have to change that, and so in our process, there's some breakdowns that occur. Now, in this test, the breakdowns are fantastic. Like, Keith nailed it. For a little test, he's moving it just the right amount. Keith would tell you if he was here that this is really going back to traditional 2D Disney-influenced pose-to-pose key animation in CGI, which is very strange. So the animators are told to just hit the key poses and instead not let Maya, the software, interpret the in-betweens, which would be fluid, but to go through and make those in a more staccato manner, but intelligently. Don't let the software do it. Intelligently do it as you need to support the movement, to support what the character's trying to communicate. Anyways, this test came out in January 17, and like for all of us was like, touchdown! Because we've been working on it since the fall of 2015. We've been working on that tech and trying all kinds of renders. I could show you other ones that were terrible, but this one got there, and it was super exciting. But it raised a lot of questions. It raised questions that Joël had to immediately answer, which are, how much blur do we want? How does the background move? And all kinds of other things. So Joël, the first test we did was in that space, and I have a visual to show. But tell us a little about this process.
So, Magnetic Dreams was brought in really halfway through because Nicholas had been working on all the art. They had a lot of the models had been done outside of Nashville too. And so really when I was brought into the project was towards the end as far as trying to wrap up all the awesome artist work. And to come back to how we actually got in, Chris and Keith Lango came to the studio to kind of explain what they wanted to do, and it's almost like there's a checklist of things that I wanted to do and experiment with in animation, and they knocked off 8 out of the 12 that were on my list, and I was like, well, I want to work on this. So we had in 2009, 2011, we had worked on some motion comics for Marvel, and we were trying to integrate 3D characters into comic book paintings and drawings. And so basically, we actually had already run into all the walls that you're not supposed to do. You know, we already hit those. And so when they were talking about things they wanted to do, it's like, yeah, I know that's not going to work because we've already failed at that. I know that's not going to work either. And when you talk about this motion signature, that was one thing that's like, that's going to work because that was on our list of, if you can have a good-looking painting or a comic panel, you don't have to animate the character. If your design and your composition and everything's working aesthetically, if if you're in this world right here, you don't have to keep them moving, which is exactly what Chris is saying. In the 3D world, as far as phases of animation, there's, you start out with layout, and then blocking is when they really just do poses, and then they start refining, and the blocking happens really fast, and it's the refining that takes weeks of animators' time, because it really, the computer does do stuff, but then you have to make sure it doesn't do what you don't want to do. So if you have a hand here and one keyframe and a hand here the other, you don't want it going through the face. So you have to make sure you're working all the curves and everything. So without being too technical, the Wingfeather Saga, the approach they wanted to do is exactly it hit all the boxes as far as what I wanted to do. So when Keith and Chris showed me this first test they had, some of the things that I was wondering about.
There's the nose shadow. There's the whole discussion about the mouse.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, a lot of small things, but like, gosh, the character is moving, kind of stopped like this. So you'll notice the camera is smooth, and we also have depth of field, which is like a blur. We have like a golden blur back there, and one of the first questions I was Chris was like, well, if we have these paintings, and Nicholas is making these paintings, and he's actually adding the distance with paint strokes, why am I adding a blur on top of this, or why are we adding a blur? So we had this whole conversation about what is happening in camera and what is happening on a painting surface, and you were kind of fighting those fights right there. And so most of the time, I think we decided that we would not add the blur, but we would add it on specific
as needed for cinematic language. So they needed to draw a focus depth to change perspective. So have you looking at this and then look over at this? We could do it that way. We're trying to use it more cinematically, but this is very much a space of strategic execution where we talk about cool stuff. Like Nicholas said earlier, lots of cool stuff shows up that you could do, right? Including really interesting depth of field. You'll see this one is clean. The layers of this painting don't have any depth of field on it. The one I showed you first did, right? So we get back to this one, see how that depth of field applied. Everything gets soft back there. So there's questions. I mean, we could do that. Should we do that? And then the other thing that was on here was some film grain, like the old film grain stuff. Like, do we want that texture in there? And Joel came back pretty sharply on that one.
Yeah, the film grain. I knew what I was trying to do. Basically, is trying to meld in your character with your background. Because that's the big fight too. That fight we had with our Marvel stuff. Is like as soon as we animated characters, like, oh, we're in two different worlds. We have a 3D character and a 2D background. And so the grain here was trying to compress everything together. In my opinion, I was telling Chris, I think it's given it a retro vintage feel. Like why we have more grain on these paintings. So one of the first things we tried out was instead of adding grain, like film grain to it, was adding paper texture to kind of bring it back into the art world. And so we have paper texture that was moving, and one of the things we wanted to do is keep things so nothing moves on a regular pattern or rhythm. Just like the animation, nothing is set on certain amount of keyframes. Everything is based on the motion and what's happened through there. We did the same thing with the grain. It's like how much grain, we're just going to change it. It's going to be in a random pattern to kind of go with the brush stroke.